And I started as an area scout with the Cincinnati Reds and moved to a cross-checker. And then I was there for 12 years and then came over to Washington about 7 years ago. And I've been cross-checking and national cross-checker.
Let's see, so I played professional baseball, signed with the Angels in '87. Started my scouting career with the Cleveland Indians in '94. Was with Cleveland for a few years, went to Montreal, and then over to the Arizona Diamondbacks, all as an area scout in 2001, won World Series there, and then continued on in the same role until I got over to Washington as a West Coast cross-checker and a national cross-checker.
Jimmy, can you first can you tell me what is an amateur baseball scout? What does an amateur baseball scout do, and how do they do that?
Well, for me, an amateur baseball scout, you go all over the country, all over the world actually, trying to find the best players that you can find to help your major league club someday.
What is an amateur baseball player?
Well, an amateur baseball player could be a high school player, a college player. It could be an international player that hasn't signed a professional contract. So anybody who's not playing professional baseball, basically.
Okay. And Mark, let's talk about what a professional baseball player is first, because a lot of people think that a professional baseball player is only in the major leagues.
Right. No, you're a minor league player first, yeah, unless very gifted. Minor league player, but it becomes a job too. So a lot of travel. For me, it was a great experience, even though it was brief. But and it's a different environment from an amateur player, because now it becomes your livelihood. So you are now being paid for what you do. But I wouldn't change it for the world. Yeah.
And so now we just talked about an amateur baseball scout, but what does a pro scout do? That's different.
Right, and that's something I've never done, but
you know what it is.
Exactly, I do. So flipping back and forth, but professional scout now is one who will spend his entire time covering all the minor league players. That is his. It's two separate. We have a scouting department for the amateur scouts, and then really a pro department for the pro scouts. Their job is to see all the minor league players. Yeah.
Great. And then there's a third subdivision beyond all that, and that's advanced scouting. What is advanced scouting?
Well, I would look at an advanced scout as a scout who basically advances the major league team, our major league club. So, for instance, if we're going into to play the Mets next weekend, you would have your advanced scout in there, taking his notes and doing all his stuff to forward on to Davey Johnson and the rest of the club.
Okay. Yeah, let's talk about international scouts too, because it's its own separate kind of thing.
Absolutely, and that's more of a and really and I've done a little bit of that, but that's not my forte. But that's a whole, and you're dealing with countries now, so which is interesting to me. Any type of scouting, but that takes them all over the world. Yeah, a different environment, different laws or different dynamics as far as the amateur side.
Can you relate to me how the player ultimately gets up to the level where he makes it onto the draft board so that he can get drafted?
Sure. And it's changed a little bit in the last 10 or 12 years, but a lot of clubs have a bird dog scout or an associate scout, and they usually work locally. They'll go out and see players, and then they'll recommend them to the area scout. The area scout usually has a territory that he works, like Texas or California or whatever state. And if he likes the player enough, he'll have a cross-checker go see that player. Usually players that were considered higher up in the draft. And then if the cross-checker really likes him, your national cross-checker will see him, your scouting director, and possibly even your general manager if it's going to be a really high pick, especially if you're picking high like 1-1, like what we did with Strasburg and Bryce Harper. And you take those names into the room and you put them in order based on the way you saw them, and everybody kind of gets their opinion. You line them up, and you make your selections.
When you're evaluating a player, what is it that you look for?
Well, you get the 5 tools. A lot of it, for me, it's almost, you have the 5 tools. You hit, power, run, field, and throw. Those are your tools. Now, obviously, it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You got a huge field out there. You got players all over, and basically, you're applying the tools to the positions they play. But now you're giving and taking too. I mean, catching, whether it's eliminating the run. Shortstop needs to do certain things. Center fielder, he's got to run. And basically, you're applying those tools to the positions that these guys are playing currently. But like I said, for me, it's like a puzzle too, because they're not always going to play, especially your high school kids, aren't necessarily going to play where they're currently on the field. So now you're going to move them. You're moving them as you're setting there sometimes. You're moving them around and putting them in a spot to where now, by the time you leave the ballpark, now this is what I see. This is where I see this kid. And that's kind of how I do it. Yeah.
Great. Jimmy, so that's the physical side of things, but physical isn't the only thing. It's like there's plenty of ball players who've got tools out there, but they couldn't make it for other reasons. Can you talk a little bit about
sure.
the things that you can't see, but that are, and talk about how important they are?
Sure. Yeah, the physical tools, most people can see those. The makeup of the player, you're really when you invest in a player, you're investing in that person. And you got to know what you have, especially with a high pick. You've got to know that you've got a guy that's going to show up at the ballpark every day to get better, to someday help your major league club. And so that's probably where we miss the most as scouts, is not on the ability. We can tell if a guy throws 100 miles an hour. That's not a problem. But we've got to be able to tell what type of player this guy is going to be every day, desire, work ethic, just the way he plays the game, off the field, how he handles himself, how mature he is as a player. Can he handle professional baseball if he's a young high school player, those type of things.
Like, who creates the scouting report, and who is it for, and what should a good scouting report tell the person who's making the final decision?
Well, a good scouting report will identify, it's almost like artwork. It's a painting of the player that our area guys see. So our area guys are going to go out, see the player, they're going to identify the player, they will evaluate the player, they will write the report, where me and Jimmy all of us will get to see the reports. And basically, it comes from within as far as the report writing goes. It's like artwork. It's identifying what they have just seen. And Mike Rizzo will also see those reports, and they will, and that helps him and I identify to where we're also going. But I mean, as far as the report writing goes, they're pretty much seen by quite a bit of people. But for me, it's an expression on what you have just seen as as an amateur scout with this particular player. So a lot goes into it.
Great.
Yeah.
And Jimmy, when you're comparing reports from different scouts
Mm-hmm.
write in different ways, and they're doing different. How do you juggle all those things? Talk about the role of the cross-checker in trying to
Sure.
figure that.
Well, the first thing you try to do is see all the players, so you can make that decision on your own. You want to, so you can compare them. And then the second thing you do when you're dealing with scouts is, the biggest thing in this game is experience, and you tend to lean towards the scouts that have the experience, whether it's good or bad. Sometimes you have to get players released to understand that, that's not a guy that's going to play in the big leagues. But that's what I do. I lean towards the guys that have been productive, that I know have a better feel than maybe a first-year scout on a player, especially high in the draft.
Talk a little bit about how a scout evaluates himself, and about how he's evaluated ultimately by the club.
Well, yeah, I mean, you draft a player, and our scout recommends a player, and you get him in your system, and you just find out how he excels there. That's at the end of the day, they're going to ask you as a scout, which players have you signed, and that's kind of your trademark and your calling card is who you've signed as a player. As a scout. Like I said, the experience is the only way. Sometimes it may take 4 or 5 years to find out. I'm sure there's been guys that have taken players that other people don't like, and 4 or 5 years later, they're not with that club, and those players are all-stars.
Right.
So it's just, you know, it just takes some time to find out sometimes. Very, very, you know, the players that get there that quick are kind of the no-brainers, you know.
I know that there's the whole Moneyball book and movie are out there. Some people have seen it, some people have not. But there's a basic idea that's talked about in that idea. You don't even have to have seen the movie to know that it sets up a stats versus scouts kind of dichotomy. I wonder if you would talk about what the reality in a ball club is in dealing with those kinds of.
Well, I think even as they took that approach, and not that I went through it with them, but we still use the stats. But basically, number one, for me, it was always about evaluating the player. But even as they were doing what they were doing, I was still going over my stats. So and it was still important. But the bottom line for me, it always came down to the player. What did the player tell me? And you know, as you sat there and watched this individual on the field, good stats, bad stats, you know, it doesn't really matter. See, I think there's a different philosophy for everybody, and which is fine. Yeah, and that's you know, basically I've been in a system, and the philosophy has worked just fine for us, and that's the approach I've taken for the last 13, 14 years. Mm-hmm. And it's identifying the player and the tools that the player has. Then you talk about all the other stuff that goes with it, off-field stuff, the makeup.
I want to talk very quickly about the draft. Talk a little bit about the difficulty of going out and scouting when you know that you've only got a 1 in 30 chance of getting the guy, even if you're right.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think you do it as an individual and then you do it as a group, is that you identify players. And even though you may think a guy's a second rounder, if that's a guy you really want, you try to get him. And there's, you know, every year we probably have as a group a handful, maybe 10 guys that we say, man, we really want this guy. It might be a 10th rounder, it might be a 20th rounder, it might be a first rounder, but we say we really want this guy. And I think if you just line the board up and just say we're going to stick just to the way the board says, then you're going to get beat in the draft. But if you identify the players and then you listen to especially your area scouts who've seen these guys for years, and you line them up and say, this is the guy I want. We like in our draft room, we put a special tag on players that we have a gut feel for, that this guy is going to be a big leaguer, and we'll put him on the board accordingly to that, so we have the best chance of getting him.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean the guidelines, you know, they're all prefed out, 1,500 players. But even though you've seen the majority of those players during a year's time, when you're in there, you can look at that board as they're lined up, and you just know, these 10 we have to have. And that's kind of how, then everything kind of flies out the window, and you are, the only thing at that time you're trying to do is make sure you get those 10 players. And like he said, it doesn't matter where they're at, but you want to get them.
I'll give you a short story on that real quick. Is when I was with the Reds, I had Jay Bruce in our area. And I think that year we picked 9th or 10th. And we saw Jay the first week, and we knew that was the guy we wanted to take with our first pick. And we started counting down the teams. Well, this team wouldn't take him, would they? And this team, we were actually scouting the other teams so hard because that was our guy from day one that we wanted to take in the draft. We were just hoping that he would get to us. You know, actually to where you're asking the other teams, who do you like up there? You know, hoping they didn't mention Jay Bruce's name.
And hoping they weren't going to lie to you.
Exactly.
And, you know, and on the note, you'd asked him a question earlier regarding the player and, you know, being chosen 2 picks ahead. You know, with the experience of doing this so long, you try not to get too involved with the player anymore, to where it's so great, the pain. I remember when I first started, oh, this guy is he's going to get there, he's going to get there. They just picked him right ahead of you. And it was painful. You've had so much invested in these players. So now you kind of turn the corner, you take a different approach to it now. Yeah. Now, although still painful at times. But, yeah.
For each of you, Jimmy first and then Mark, was there somebody in particular that helped you when you were first getting started in scouting that you think, you know, this person really embodied scouting to me and taught me a little something about this profession that I've been able to carry along with me?
Sure, I was lucky when I started with the Reds. I had 4 or 5 guys. One was Larry Barton, and he had been in the Reds for about 30 years. We spent a lot of time together. taught me about scouting. We were a big tryout camp organization at that time, and taught me how to run those. Bob Zuck taught me a lot about hitting, and we had a really good rapport. And he would go to me with games. He loved to see hitters. He would call me and say, "Tell me, give me your best 5 hitters." He didn't care what round they were, and we'd go see them. And he'd help me get those players when I was a young scout. Those 2 guys really helped me a lot.
Actually, mine would be Jay Robertson, who is currently with us on the major league side. But that's who I began with. He gave me my first job. But very bright, knowledgeable baseball person. And in fact, the hands that we're currently in between, you know, guys like that and Mike with the current club that we're with, you know, just tremendous baseball people. Yeah, I mean, really, really good. But I would say Jay Robertson was the one who really taught me quite a bit. Absolutely.
What is a tryout camp, and how does it work? How did it work?
Yeah, well, there's not as many now because of all the showcases and the events that they have.
So the showcase is kind of replacing those.
They kind of have, but we still do them. Like we'll have, you know, pre-draft camps or workouts or, you know, things like that in the summer. But the way the tryout camps run is that you usually during the summer you would set these up in different cities around the areas. I remember we used to do 30 in 30 days right after the draft. And we would set up. And the guy who set them up was horrible coordinating because he'd do Houston, then New Orleans, Dallas, Baton Rouge, back and forth, and you would pray for a day of rain. But you would show up at the camps, and you would sometimes have 50 or 60 kids. Sometimes you'd have 200. And you would just run them through, you know, the 60-yard dash. You would have them all throw. You would BP every guy, so you had to be able to throw and do that. And what we would do was make a list of all the players we had seen during the summer, and we would, at the end of the summer, have that list, and those were the guys we went and saw. Well, as a matter of fact, when I started, we had a rule that if he didn't come through your tryout camp, you couldn't draft him. And I always saw some great players. I mean, we had Josh Beckett in our camp when he was 15 years old. We had Homer Bailey in our camp when he was young. And you would kind of establish a relationship with those players because they knew you because you'd be there as a freshman and a sophomore and a junior. And by the time he was a senior, I don't know what would help you actually sign the player, but at least you had a better rapport with him and you knew the player.